For this typical loving family, it was just another Sunday. They went to church, as they always did, and then they took their usual afternoon nap. But this is when things stopped being ordinary. Following a frantic 911 call, police arrived to discover an intruder had slipped into their home and executed each and every one of them in their sleep. It had all the hallmarks of a robbery gone horrifically wrong, but the more they looked at the crime scene, the more it began to paint a picture of a meticulously evil plan. What followed was an investigation weighed down with dead ends and no leads. But with some unprecedented detective work and some creative forensics, they were finally able to put the right man behind bars. Hello and welcome to the Little Shop of Crime. My name is Steve, and in store today is one of the weirdest ways I've ever seen a criminal get caught. It's the perfect example of how those who think they've pulled off the perfect crime often miss the little things. Like bugs, insects, creepy crawlies, call them what you want, but in today's story they prove to be the most damning of witnesses. This is the Harper family massacre. Today's story begins in Bakersfield, California, a mid-sized city just over 100 miles northwest of Los Angeles. Home to 400,000 or so, Bakersfield is affectionately known as Nashville West, a nod to its legacy in country music. Situated in the heart of the state's Central Valley, Bakersfield is a cornerstone of the breadbasket of California, surrounded by vast swathes of crop fields. Beyond these can be found serene national forests or the majestic Sierra Nevada mountains, which form a picturesque backdrop. Bakersfield itself is vibrant and multicultural, often described as a fast-growing city with a small-town community feel. And back in July of 2003, in a corner home of one of its residential neighborhoods, lived the Harper family. They were a modest family, well respected in the community. Ernestine Harper was an outspoken civil rights activist at 70 years of age. She was fiercely devoted to her loved ones. Living with her daughter and grandchildren allowed her to provide a helping hand raising them. Joni was her fifth and youngest child at 39, and by all accounts she was a hard-working and dedicated mother. A school supervisor and Division I basketball coach, Joni was adored by her colleagues, as well as the children at her school. She was recently separated from her husband, but together they had 3 young children. Marcus, who was 4, 2-year-old Lindsay, and baby Marshall, who was just 6 weeks old. The Harpers were a devoted Christian family. Every week they each put on their Sunday best and made their way to church for the morning worship services. But this particular day was special. It was the first time Joni introduced baby Marshall to the rest of her congregation. She beamed as she proudly showed him off. Afterwards, the family met with Joni's best friend Kelsey for lunch at the Black Angus. This was a regular routine. They'd get home at around 2 p.m. to sleep before heading back to church for the evening services at 6 p.m. But this time, they never made it to those services. Kelsey called the Harper home at 8 p.m, but there was no answer. Nor was there an answer at all the following day. Worried, Kelsey went over to the house at the crack of dawn on Tuesday. From the outside, everything appeared normal. Kelsey tried a side door with a key Joni had given her, but something was blocking it. So she went round to the back of the house and found the sliding patio doors unlocked. This struck her as really unusual. She walked into the house and was met with eerie silence. She called out for Joni and for Ernestine, but there was no response. Facing the patio doors was Joni's bedroom. Kelsey walked inside, and it was a bloodbath. It was 7 a.m. when she made a distraught call to 911. Police arrived within minutes to scenes that would shock even the most seasoned detectives. In the master bedroom, they found the body of Joni Harper, covered with blood-soaked bedsheets. She was lying face down on her bed with 2 gunshot wounds in her head and 2 in her arm. She'd also been stabbed 7 times in her back. There was a knife missing from the block in the kitchen. It couldn't be located, but its dimensions were consistent with the wounds. Lying across the foot of the bed was 2-year-old Lindsay. She'd been shot once in her back. On the other side of the bed was Marcus, who'd suffered a single gunshot wound to the right side of his head. It was evident that he was awake when he was killed. His eyes were open, and he had significant bite injuries to his fingers and blood in his mouth. He'd been so scared he'd chewed his fingers for comfort, and had bitten them right down to the bone. Numerous .22 caliber shells littered the bedroom floor. Police searched the rest of the house, and they found Ernestine Harper in the small hallway that led from her bedroom. She'd been shot twice in the face. Lying beside her was her old .38 caliber revolver. She'd evidently heard the commotion and fetched her gun, but didn't get a chance to fire it. More expended .22 caliber shells were found nearby. Kelsey had told police that there should be a fifth person in the house, 6-week-old Marshall, but he didn't appear to be around. They began to wonder if he'd been the target of kidnapping, and his family was collateral damage. But 3 hours later, the disturbing truth was revealed when a pillow was taken from the bed. It had been obscuring his tiny body the entire time, lying beside his mother. He'd been shot once in the back, just like his sister. Lindsay was still wearing the very same blue dress that she'd proudly shown off at church 2 days before, and Joni's Sunday best was still folded neatly nearby. It was clear they'd been killed 2 days earlier, on July 6th, while they all took a nap right after church. This was consistent with the rate of decomposition. Police were left wondering what type of monster would murder an entire family, including 3 very young children, while they slept. The crime scene photographs show the house was a complete mess. It had been ransacked, drawers and boxes had been emptied out, paperwork scattered across the carpet. In a lounge, a flat-screen TV was lying face down on the floor, and in the laundry room, Joni's purse had been emptied out, presumably in a frantic search for valuables. It looked to police as though the Harper family had fallen victim to a burglary that had gone tragically awry. Police urgently wanted to speak to one person in particular. Vincent Brothers, Joni's estranged husband and father of the 3 children. They needed to let him know what had happened to his family. But he was out of town, really out of town, in North Carolina. Vincent had been in Ohio for the past 6 days visiting his brother Melvin. On the day the murders were discovered, the pair were on their way to visit their mother over in North Carolina. Detectives took the earliest flight they could from LAX, arriving the next morning. They hoped that he could shed some light on the investigation and anyone who might want to hurt his loved ones. There was also a concern for his safety. Whoever killed them might also be targeting him. By the time they arrived, his mother had already broken the news to him. Margaret Brothers said of the moment, "I held him real tight, and he broke away from me. He started running and screaming and hollering." Soon after, Vincent walked into a police station in Elizabeth City. They brought him in for an interview, and as you can probably imagine, he was utterly devastated, as anyone would be if they'd just found out their entire family had been massacred. In fact, he was hysterical, incoherent. He could barely form a sentence, let alone provide the detectives with any credible information. But something didn't seem quite right, and following what they thought was a bizarre interview, investigators started looking at Vincent as a possible suspect, but they pretty quickly realised he was an unlikely culprit. Vincent grew up in Bellport, Long Island. After serving in the military, he moved west to complete a master's degree in education in California. It was when he began working at John C. Fremont Elementary School in Bakersfield that he met Joni Harper. Although it ultimately didn't work out, Vincent was the love of Joni's life. They seemed well matched, worked in education, shared a deep Christian faith. He had a daughter from a previous relationship, and Joni apparently loved that he had a good relationship with her, and with kids in general. He seemed to adore them. They went on to have 3 beautiful kids of their own. Vincent Brothers went on to become vice principal of the school, and a damn good one. He was a beloved mentor. He'd welcome children to class in the morning with a huge grin and open arms, and together he and Joni escorted kids home on their bicycles to make sure they got there safely. Safe to say, he was well liked and respected in the community. He certainly didn't seem like the kind of guy who would murder his own wife and children as they slept. Not only that, but his alibi was solid. The murders happened on July 6th. Flight logs proved Vincent flew out 4 days earlier, on the 2nd. CCTV footage at Columbus Airport also proved he arrived there. He stayed with his brother through the weekend. Melvin confirmed this. He was surrounded by other eyewitnesses in Ohio. His phone pinged there the entire time, and he was able to provide 2 receipts from purchases he'd made using his credit card there, on the very same day they were killed, over 2,000 miles away. Vincent Brothers was ruled out as a suspect. After their trip to North Carolina, detectives revisited the crime scene. There they attempted to retrace the killer's steps. A bolt that secured the sliding patio doors had been removed. This was almost certainly how the intruder entered the home, but it was tampered with from the inside, which only raised further questions, particularly as there were no signs of forced entry elsewhere, and since everyone was sleeping, they obviously weren't invited in. They first entered the master bedroom and shot Joni multiple times in the head and arms. She was still fast asleep when she was killed. The offender then moved around to the foot of the bed and shot Lindsay once in the back from close range. Unburnt gunpowder stippled her little blue dress. At this point they appear to have heard Ernestine moving and probably shouting. They raced through the home and shot her twice in the face, and she and her revolver fell to the floor. Forensic examination of the weapon later showed that she had in fact tried to fire it, multiple times, but the weapon was so old that it jammed. The intruder returned to the master bedroom to find Marcus sitting up in the bed, next to his dead mother and sister. The killer walked around to his side of the bed and fired once into the side of the 4-year-old boy's head, killing him instantly. Finally, they leaned over and shot little Marshall once in his lower back. The newest member of the Harper family was the last to be killed. It begged the question, why kill the children at all? At least 2 of them were far too young to be witnesses. And if this had indeed been a robbery gone wrong, why would a burglar choose this particular house? It was the corner lot on a busy street, and the home was heavily fortified, with a spiked metal fence and wrought iron bars across all of the windows. Looking at the other properties around it, this would be the last house in the area you'd choose to break into. And had this in fact been a robbery gone wrong, surely this is the moment they would leave. They'd fired a lot of shots, in the middle of the day, on a Sunday when most people are at home. But the killer wasn't done yet. Autopsy results showed that the knife wounds inflicted on Joni hadn't bled as normal. She was stabbed post-mortem. They were inflicted in anger. This was no robbery gone wrong. This was personal. This was somebody who knew the Harpers well, who knew their routine, that they'd be napping at precisely that time on a Sunday after church. And look again at the block with the missing knife. The kitchen was cluttered and the block was hidden behind boxes, but the killer found it without moving anything out of the way. They knew where to look. They were familiar with the house. Even after stabbing Joni, the offender still wasn't finished. They began to cover the victims with pillows and a sheet taken from a wardrobe in another room. Detectives saw this as ritualized behavior, almost indicative of remorse. The killer definitely had a relationship with the victims. Then the crime scene was staged to look like a burglary. Look again at the photograph of the TV. This person went to the trouble of disconnecting it, but instead of then taking it away, they set it gently down on the carpet. It made no sense. The house was a mess, but it was all an illusion. Jewellery boxes were undisturbed, nothing was taken. Not even $106 in cash, clearly visible on a table near to the dismantled TV. No valuables were missing from Joni's purse either, after it had been emptied onto the laundry room floor. The intruder's goal wasn't to rob the place at all. It was to annihilate the Harper family, and it went exactly as planned. A large-scale investigation was launched. Locals were scared for their safety. Many were afraid to leave the house, and police patrols were heightened in the neighbourhood. They didn't know if what they were witnessing was the emergence of a serial killer, or maybe it was some sort of gang initiation. Though she bore the brunt of the ferocity, police began to look into the idea that Joni wasn't actually the target, and it was actually her mother. As an outspoken community activist, Ernestine worked with a lot of shady characters, young offenders, gang members, even suspected murderers. The family was always worried that the type of work she did might generate enemies, as was Ernestine herself. There was always the fear that someone might break into the house and hurt her, hence their heavy fortification. Police enlisted the help of gang informants, but they found nothing at all. No word on the street about anyone who might be out to hurt her, or her family. The investigation rolled on. Local criminals and burglars were ruled out one by one. There were loads and loads of tips, but even more dead ends. And still they had no eyewitnesses, no murder weapons, no clear motive. Over 2,000 people attended the funeral of the Harper family. It was broadcast on local television to a shaken community. Family members gave stirring eulogies for each of the victims. Colourful sprays of flowers and family photographs adorned the 4 white caskets. Little Marshall was buried with his mother. Vincent Brothers entered the auditorium dabbing his eyes with a handkerchief. But investigators weren't entirely convinced by his tears. The personal nature of the crime kept drawing them back to him, but what was most odd was that not once in any interview did he express any interest in actually knowing what had happened to his wife and children. And to add to their growing suspicion, they received a phone call out of the blue. It was from a neighbour of the Harpers, calling to report that they'd seen a person matching the description of Vincent Brothers in the patio area at the back of the house on the weekend of the murders. So they began to dig a little deeper into him, and they found that he had a few skeletons in his closet. His and Joni's relationship was a lot rockier than it had appeared on the surface. They'd actually been married twice. Their first in the year 2000 was annulled a few months later, when she found out he'd kept 2 previous marriages secret from her. Their relationship was on and off after this, but they married again in Vegas in January 2003. But by March he'd moved out of the family home again. She was tired of his extramarital affairs. Interviews with his friends shed light on the fact that Vincent hadn't been faithful to Joni in either of their marriages, or his other ones. Serial infidelity was a long-term habit of his. In fact, there were a number of women he'd been seeing around the time of the murders. Police began to wonder if the culprit could be a jealous girlfriend or ex, so they systematically questioned each of them. None were deemed capable. And of course, infidelity didn't mean Vincent was a murderer. But they kept digging. Back in 1988, Vincent was convicted of spousal abuse. He was jailed for 6 days and placed on 3 years probation. His second wife sued him for divorce in 1992 after he was violent and he threatened to kill her when she confronted him about one of his many unexplained disappearances. Then in 1996 he was accused of harassing a work colleague on a number of occasions. On one occasion it was physical, but she managed to run away, but he later made threatening phone calls to her. Shockingly, police apparently dissuaded her from filing a complaint against such a respected community member. The school investigated, but Vincent denied the allegations and was never formally disciplined. All of the victims of Vincent Brothers' abuse said the same thing. He was a really nice guy. Until he wasn't. Investigators were beginning to see Vincent for who he really was. He had a Jekyll and Hyde personality. The friendly, nice guy principal everyone saw was a thin veneer. He wasn't the upstanding pillar of the community that everyone seemed to think. But there was one piece of new information that really piqued the interest of the detectives. Joni was actually making plans to divorce Vincent and to sue him for child support. They began to formulate a possible motive. Perhaps Vincent was angry with her, and he wanted to start a new, fresh, single life without the financial burden of 3 children and his ex-wife. Now they had a better picture of the man they'd been dealing with and a potential motive, investigators took a closer look at his alibi to see if it was as airtight as it originally appeared. They knew Vincent arrived in Columbus on the evening of July 2nd, 4 days before the murders. He was visiting and staying with his brother Melvin, who validated this. So they began to retrace his steps in Ohio. The first step was to verify those receipts, which placed Vincent in both an Ohio restaurant and a Walmart on the day of the murders. Detectives worked their way through checkout surveillance footage taken from the time his credit card was used. Shockingly, the man on the tapes wasn't Vincent. It was his brother Melvin. He was hauled in for an interview.
We've got you making the purchases after telling a lie. We've got you using his credit card and signing his name to the purchases.
Melvin initially denied forging his brother's signature, but when confronted with the video evidence, he changed his story. He admitted Vincent had asked him to pick up some items from Walmart for him on the Sunday and had given him his credit card to pay for them.
I didn't know where Vincent was at. Just like I tell you right now, I don't know if he was in California doing that or not. You're lying to me right now.
Melvin eventually admitted to police that he had no knowledge of his brother's whereabouts between July 4th and July 7th. In fact, they were unable to find anyone who saw Vincent in Ohio during those 3 critical days. Confronted with these fresh allegations, Vincent tried to explain it all away by telling detectives he'd spent those days driving around with his other brother, Troy, looking for colleges where he could finish his doctoral degree. But detectives weren't buying it, and so they began to wonder whether it was possible that Vincent Brothers had used those 72 hours to somehow make a 4,500-mile round trip to Bakersfield to murder his family. Vincent was placed under 24-hour surveillance while they built a case around him. By now they firmly believed he was involved, even if all their evidence was still circumstantial. They believed his entire trip to Ohio was crafted to provide him with a false alibi. They just needed to figure out how he managed to pull it off. They started to look into it, but no flight logs had Vincent on board. He didn't appear to have used any buses or trains either. It was just about possible for him to have gone by car if he drove continuously and got no sleep. And as it happened, Vincent had hired a car for the duration of his stay, a Dodge Neon that he paid for in cash. Detectives tracked it down in the hope it could shed some light on his activity, and according to the hire company, Vincent Brothers had put quite a few miles on it. The car was brought in for inspection, and diagnostics checks proved it. More than 5,400 miles he'd added to the car, more than enough to account for a round trip to Bakersfield. This was an enormous break in their case. The detectives looked further into the car's history and found it had only been hired a few times before. They tracked down and spoke to each of the previous renters. It seemed the car had never even left Columbus, at least not before Vincent got hold of it. The detectives now knew that the car could have been driven to California. They just needed to prove that it had. And it wasn't long before something else about the vehicle caught their eye. Freshly killed bugs, lots of them, caught in the radiator. The hire car was disassembled. Detectives came up with a fantastic idea, something they'd never done before. To use the insect parts found trapped within the car's radiator in the hope that they could place the car near to the crime scene. So they enlisted the help of Dr. Lynn Kimsey, director of the Bohart Museum of Entomology in California. She is one of the state's preeminent experts on insects, particularly those native to California. They arrived at the museum with the radiator and asked if she could identify every single bug. And that's precisely what she did. Using tweezers, Dr. Kimsey meticulously removed every speck and wing and leg and bug part that she could find, and identified the creature each and every one of them belonged to. Most of what she found belonged to common bugs, a lot of bee parts, houseflies, things you get all over the country. But she also found a number of more interesting parts, those of a species of paper wasp and 2 different tree bugs that were all endemic to western states, found commonly on 2 major routes through to California. But there was one thing in particular that really stood out to her. The leg from a rather distinctive looking grasshopper. The leg had belonged to a red-shanked grasshopper, a species found only west of the Rockies. In fact, according to Dr. Kimsey, its centre of abundance is, in fact, California. Along with the odometer readings, they now had crucial evidence that placed this rental car in the vicinity of the scene of the crime. But all of this just proved he travelled west. The evidence was still circumstantial. The detectives wanted the smoking gun, something that actually placed Vincent at the Harper house that weekend. When they looked back through the evidence, they spotted something they'd initially missed, amongst the contents of Joni's emptied purse. At first it appeared to be a seemingly unimportant shred of material, before they realised exactly what it was. The very tip of a latex glove. It could of course be nothing. Gloves are used for all sorts of legitimate reasons, but they're also often used by criminals, so it was worth a look. Inside they found a DNA sample that came back with a 1 in 16 billion certainty of belonging to Vincent Brothers. This wasn't the concrete evidence they wanted. It didn't prove when he was there, but along with the other evidence, they believed they had enough to charge Vincent Brothers with the murders. It was now almost 10 months since the family massacre, and the ongoing surveillance into Vincent revealed that he'd begun selling his belongings, and he'd put his house on the market. It looked like he was preparing to skip town. So at the crack of dawn, the detectives made an arrest when he went out to check his mail, and Vincent Brothers was charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. They'd just have to wait and see if the mostly circumstantial evidence they had would be enough to persuade a jury of his guilt. The trial was postponed for almost 3 years due to the story's frenzied media attention and public scrutiny, which gives us time for a recap. This is how the detectives think it all happened. Vincent Brothers wanted rid of his wife and his children because they were a financial impediment to his future. Obviously he couldn't just kill them because he'd be suspect number 1 on the police's list, as was the case. So he crafted this elaborate alibi to be in Ohio, nearly 2,500 miles away. On July 2nd he flew there, being captured on CCTV at Columbus Airport. He rented a car, and on July 4th he began the journey right back to Bakersfield, driving non-stop, hoovering up bugs along the way and paying for gas with cash so that his credit card wouldn't give the game away. He left his phone in Ohio so it would ping there, and his credit card with Melvin to purchase some things on the Sunday. He knew his family would be at church that day and that they would all be sleeping at around 2 PM. But how did he get into the house? Well, according to Joni's friend Kelsey, Vincent had just recently offered to take Joni's car to be serviced. On her car keys, she had a house key. It seemed that Vincent had made a duplicate. While the family were at church, he let himself into the house and removed the bolt from the sliding patio doors, leaving them unsecured. He exited through the patio, which is where the neighbour saw him. He hid out the back until the Harpers returned to sleep, then he entered through the sliding doors and systematically executed each of them. He then made the 33-hour-long drive back to Ohio, arriving late on Monday the 7th. The trial eventually began on February 22, 2007. The prosecution was tasked with dismantling Vincent's alibi, so they presented their proposed timeline. They emphasised his darker past, his infidelities, and his history of abuse. They put it to the jury that he killed his wife and children to avoid paying alimony to her from the impending divorce, as well as child support for 3 kids for the next 20 years. The defence claimed that all evidence against Vincent was superficial. They reminded the jury that extramarital affairs certainly didn't make him a murderer. They were keen to point out the fact that there wasn't a trace of Vincent found between Ohio and California, despite detectives reenacting the drive and painstakingly checking footage from every single one of over 100 gas stations on the likely routes to Bakersfield. The glove tip? It meant nothing. Vincent regularly visited the home to fix or replace things for Ernestine. His DNA and fingerprints would be all over the place. According to them, even the insect evidence was flimsy, and the parts could simply be transferred from passing vehicles. They were eager to present their star witness, Vincent's brother Troy. He was going to take the stand and swear under oath that he and his brother had indeed been together on the Sunday looking at colleges. But in a damning blow for the defence, Troy had had a change of heart. He didn't show up. But in a surprise move, the defence called Vincent himself to the stand. This was risky and unusual.
Joni, Marcus, Lindsay and Marshall, and Miss Harper.
His tearful and frankly quite believable performance forced prosecutors to admit he'd been a powerful and convincing witness, and they had another ace up their sleeve. Vincent claimed that at 7 p.m. on Sunday, July 6th, the day of the murders, he'd been involved in a traffic accident in Ohio. A child on a bike had collided with his rental car. An eyewitness even took to the stand to corroborate the story. She'd seen the incident. The description of the driver and the car she gave matched Vincent and his rental car. This was a massive blow for the prosecution. That night, the detectives on the case flew back to Ohio in a desperate bid to find out what they could about this accident. And 2 days later, they called their own witness to the stand.
You remember a car being involved in a car accident in 2003, sir?
Sure.
He was the actual person involved in the collision. Vincent Brothers had been exposed as a liar in front of the entire courtroom. How he actually knew about the incident was anybody's guess. It was a damning blow for his defence. Despite the evidence being labelled circumstantial, it ultimately came down to what the jury believed. They saw a total of 1,100 exhibits and heard testimony from 137 witnesses, including Kelsey, Melvin, and Dr. Kimsey. And on May 15, 2007, they delivered their verdict.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Vincent Edward Brothers, guilty of felony, to wit, murder of Joni Harper, murder of Ernestine Harper, murder of Marcus Harper, murder of Lindsay Harper, murder of Marshall Harper.
2 weeks later, that same jury recommended a sentence of death by lethal injection. Following the verdict, detention officers found Vincent had somehow wriggled free from his leg restraints, and they found paper clips hidden in his hair, potential makeshift handcuff keys. They threw him back in Lerdo jail under increased security measures. On September 27, 2007, the now 45-year-old Vincent Brothers was formally sentenced to death. His only surviving child, 18-year-old Margaret, gave a powerful courtroom statement, ending with these words: "I am leaving my name with him. I don't have a father now. He is just a man handcuffed to a chair, looking straight ahead. He will never see me again until it's time to die." Vincent was placed on death row at San Quentin State Prison, where he remains to this day. Since California halted all executions, he'll probably never be put to death, and instead will spend the rest of his life locked up. And that's it, the Harper family massacre. It takes a different kind of evil, for him to be able to murder his own children. Like they were nothing but inconveniences to him, objects in the way of a better future. It It reminds me of the Chris Watts case. I'll never understand it. As always, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And hopefully I'll catch you at the next one. Bye for now.